The crystal chandelier cast dancing shadows across the mahogany table as Princess Catherine adjusted her silk gloves for the third time in 5 minutes. The state dining room of Kensington Palace buzzed with the quiet efficiency of 20 servants preparing for what would be the most important dinner of her young life. At 19, Catherine had attended hundreds of formal dinners, but tonight felt different. Tonight, the French ambassador and his delegation would decide whether the peace treaty between their nations would hold or crumble into another devastating war. Catherine's governess, Lady Margaret, approached with measured steps, her weathered hands smoothing imaginary wrinkles from her dark blue dress. "Your Highness," she whispered, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. "Remember what we discussed about tonight's dinner protocol?" The princess nodded, though her stomach churned with anxiety. Since childhood, she had been drilled on countless rules of royal etiquette, but one rule stood above all others in importance and consequence. No matter what happened during a formal dinner, no matter how provoked or emotional she became, Princess Catherine must never, under any circumstances, speak before being formally addressed by a visiting head of state or their representative. This wasn't merely about politeness or tradition. This rule had been written in blood, born from a tragic incident 50 years ago when her great-aunt's impulsive words during a diplomatic dinner had sparked a war that claimed thousands of lives. "The French ambassador is known for his testing nature," Lady Margaret continued, her voice barely audible above the clinking of silver and china being arranged. "He has been briefed about our customs, but some say he deliberately tries to provoke young royals to see how they respond under pressure." Catherine's fingers traced the edge of her pearl necklace, a nervous habit she had developed over the years. She had heard the stories whispered in palace corridors about Ambassador Laurent Dubois, a man in his 60s with sharp gray eyes and an even sharper tongue. He was famous throughout European courts for his ability to uncover weaknesses in diplomatic opponents. Some called him brilliant, others called him ruthless, but everyone agreed he was dangerous. "What if he insults our family?" Catherine asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if he says something about father's illness?" Lady Margaret's expression softened with understanding. The king's declining health had been carefully hidden from the public, but foreign diplomats were well informed about such matters. "You must remain silent, Your Highness. No matter what he says, no matter how it cuts, you must wait for him to address you directly. Only then may you respond, and, even then, only with the practiced diplomatic phrases we've rehearsed." The weight of responsibility pressed down on Catherine's shoulders like a heavy cloak. As the king's only daughter and heir to the throne, her behavior tonight wouldn't just reflect on her personally, but on the entire kingdom. The peace treaty hanging in the balance would determine whether her people faced another generation of war and suffering or could finally rebuild their lives in safety. A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. "Your Highness," called Thomas, the head butler. "His Majesty requests your presence in his study before the guests arrive." Catherine found her father in his private study, looking frielier than she had ever seen him. King William sat behind his massive oak desk, medical papers scattered among official documents, his once strong hands trembling slightly as he reached for his teacup. The sight made Catherine's heart ache, but she maintained her composure as she had been taught. "Sit down, my dear," the king said, gesturing to the chair across from him. "I wanted to speak with you privately before tonight's dinner." Catherine settled into the leather chair, noting how her father's breathing seemed labored. The royal physicians had been increasingly frequent visitors to the palace, though they maintained absolute discretion about the king's condition. "I know the burden we're placing on your shoulders tonight," King William began, his voice carrying the weight of years and responsibility. "The peace treaty with France isn't just about politics, Catherine. It's about the future of our people, the children who won't have to grow up in wartime, the families who won't be torn apart by conflict." "I understand, Father," Catherine replied, though she wasn't entirely sure she grasped the full magnitude of what lay ahead. The king leaned forward, his eyes intense despite his physical weakness. "The rule about remaining silent until addressed It's not arbitrary protocol. When your great-aunt spoke out of turn 50 years ago, she didn't intend to start a war. She was defending our family's honor, just as you might feel compelled to do tonight. But her words were misinterpreted, taken as a formal rejection of a peace proposal, and within months, thousands of our soldiers were dying on foreign battlefields. Catherine felt a chill run down her spine. She had known the basic story, but hearing it from her father, seeing the pain in his eyes as he recounted their family's tragic history, made the stakes feel terrifyingly real. Ambassador Du Bois will test you, the king continued. Intelligence reports suggest he's been instructed to gauge your temperament, to see if you're fit to be queen. If you fail tonight's test, if you speak out of turn or show weakness, he'll report back to his government that our kingdom is unstable, that I'm dying, and my heir is unsuitable to rule. And then? Catherine asked, though she dreaded the answer. And then, they'll find excuses to break the treaty. They'll claim we violated diplomatic protocol, that we're not trustworthy partners for peace. Within a year, we'll be back at war, and this time, with me gone, you'll be leading our people through the darkest period in our nation's history. The silence that followed felt heavy with unspoken fears. Catherine understood now that tonight wasn't just about her personal success or failure as a princess. It was about proving she had the strength and wisdom to be queen, to put her people's welfare above her own emotions and pride. There's something else, King William said quietly. Something I haven't told you about your great-aunt's story. Catherine waited, sensing that whatever came next would change her understanding of everything. She didn't just speak out of turn that night. The French ambassador of that time, a man named Rousseau, deliberately insulted her late mother's memory, knowing it would provoke a reaction. He called her mother a weak woman who died because she lacked the strength to rule properly. My aunt couldn't bear hearing such words about her beloved mother, so she stood up and challenged him publicly. Catherine felt anger rising in her chest just hearing the story. How could anyone say such cruel things? Because they wanted to test her limits, just as they'll test yours tonight. Rousseau knew exactly what he was doing. He was following orders to provoke her into breaking protocol, and she fell into his trap. Her passionate defense of family honor was seen by the French as a formal insult to their delegation, and they used it as justification to withdraw from peace negotiations. The princess sat in stunned silence, finally, understanding the true nature of the challenge she faced. This wasn't just about following rules or maintaining dignity. She was walking into a carefully orchestrated test where her enemies would use her deepest emotions against her. "How do I do it, father?" she asked, her voice small and uncertain. "How do I sit there and listen to them insult our family, our people, our kingdom, and say nothing?" King William reached across the desk and took her hands in his trembling ones. "By remembering that your silence tonight might save thousands of lives tomorrow. By understanding that true strength sometimes means swallowing your pride for the greater good. And by knowing that I believe in you completely, my dear daughter." As if summoned by the weight of their conversation, Lady Margaret appeared at the study door. "Your Majesty, Your Highness, the French delegation has arrived." Catherine rose from her chair, feeling as if she were preparing for battle rather than dinner. Her father struggled to stand, and she instinctively moved to help him, but he waved her away gently. "I must appear strong tonight," he said, "just as you must appear controlled and wise. We're performing roles, Catherine, playing parts in a larger drama that will determine our people's fate." They walked together toward the state dining room, the king's slow pace allowing Catherine time to compose herself mentally. She could hear voices speaking French in the distance, punctuated by the formal English responses of palace officials. The sounds of civilization and diplomacy, but underneath it all, she sensed the dangerous undercurrents of political maneuvering. At the entrance to the dining room, King William paused and looked at his daughter one final time. "Remember, my dear, silence is not weakness tonight. It's wisdom, and wisdom will serve our people far better than pride." Catherine nodded, straightening her shoulders and lifting her chin with practiced royal bearing. As they entered the room together, she saw Ambassador Du Bois for the first time. He was exactly as she had imagined, tall, distinguished, with penetrating gray eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of her appearance and demeanor. When their eyes met, he offered a slight bow that was technically correct, but somehow felt mocking. The dinner was about to begin, and, with it, the most important test of Catherine's young life. As she took her designated seat, she caught Lady Margaret's eye across the room and received an almost imperceptible nod of encouragement. The rule was simple, but following it would require every ounce of strength and self-control she possessed. The servants began to serve the first course, and Catherine prepared herself for whatever verbal attacks might come. She would remain silent until formally addressed. She would protect her people's future by controlling her own reactions, and she would prove herself worthy of the crown that awaited her, no matter what price her pride might pay in the process. The game was about to begin, and failure was not an option. The first course arrived with ceremonial precision, delicate bowls of French onion soup that filled the dining room with rich, savory aromas. Catherine noticed how Ambassador Du Bois waited until everyone was served before lifting his spoon, a calculated move that demonstrated his understanding of protocol while establishing his control over the meal's pace. She kept her eyes focused on her soup, though she could feel his gaze studying her like a scientist examining a specimen. "Your Majesty," Ambassador Du Bois began, his English accented but flawless. "This soup reminds me of the last formal dinner I attended in your kingdom. That was nearly 20 years ago, when your father was still a prince, and your grandfather ruled with such distinctive policies." Catherine's spoon paused halfway to her lips. The comment seemed innocent enough, but something in the ambassador's tone suggested hidden meaning. King William, despite his physical frailty, maintained perfect composure as he responded. "My father was indeed a man of strong convictions," the king said carefully. "I trust your memories of that visit are pleasant ones, Ambassador." "Oh, quite memorable," Du Bois replied, setting down his spoon with deliberate precision. "Though I must admit, the conversation that evening was rather heated. Something about trade agreements and territorial disputes. Your grandfather had such passionate opinions about French merchants operating in your coastal cities." Catherine felt her stomach tighten. She knew from her history lessons that those trade disputes had nearly led to war before being resolved through painful compromises that still affected their kingdom's economy. The ambassador was clearly testing the waters, seeing how the royal family would react to references to past conflicts. Passion can be both a strength and a weakness in diplomacy, King William observed, his tone neutral but watchful. Du Bois smiled, an expression that didn't reach his eyes. "How wise, Your Majesty. Though I've always wondered about the balance between passion and control, particularly in young leaders who must make decisions that affect thousands of lives." The comment hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. Catherine realized with growing unease that the ambassador wasn't just making conversation. He was laying groundwork, establishing themes that would likely resurface throughout the evening in more pointed ways. As the soup course concluded and servants began clearing plates, Catherine noticed movement at the edge of her vision. Ambassador Du Bois's assistant, a thin man with careful eyes, was taking notes in a small leather journal. Everything was being documented, every response, every reaction, every moment of hesitation cataloged for future analysis. The second course featured roasted pheasant with seasonal vegetables, a dish that required careful attention to cut properly. Catherine found herself grateful for the distraction of managing her cutlery, as it gave her something to focus on besides the ambassador's increasingly probing conversation. "I understand congratulations are in order, Your Majesty," Du Bois said as he expertly carved his pheasant. "The harvest this year was particularly successful despite the challenges your kingdom has faced. We've been blessed with favorable weather and the hard work of our farmers," King William replied. "Indeed, though I imagine the increased military spending over the past 2 years has placed some strain on domestic resources," Du Bois continued smoothly. Maintaining peace requires such delicate balance between security and prosperity. Catherine's fork clinked against her plate more loudly than intended. The ambassador was referencing sensitive information about their kingdom's military expenditures, information that wouldn't be publicly available. His comment about maintaining peace carried an implicit threat, suggesting that their defensive preparations might be seen as aggressive by other nations. Security investments are always carefully considered against other priorities, the king responded, but Catherine could hear the slight strain in his voice. Du Bois nodded thoughtfully. Of course, though one might wonder why a kingdom so committed to peace would need such extensive military preparations. Unless, perhaps, there are concerns about internal stability? The question hit like a physical blow. Catherine felt heat rising in her cheeks, and she had to consciously control her breathing to maintain composure. The ambassador was suggesting that their increased military spending indicated domestic unrest or weakness, a characterization that could justify French interference in their affairs. But she remained silent, even as every instinct screamed to her to defend her kingdom's policies and her father's wisdom. Lady Margaret had positioned herself where Catherine could see her, and the governess's slight nod reminded the princess that her restraint was being noticed and approved. Stability comes from many sources, King William said after a carefully measured pause. Strong institutions, faithful people, and, yes, adequate defenses against those who might mistake preparedness for aggression. Beautifully stated, Du Bois replied, though his tone suggested he found the response inadequate. Though I confess curiosity about how such policies will evolve under future leadership. Catherine's breath caught. The ambassador was directly questioning her fitness to rule, probing for information about succession plans while her father was still alive. Such inquiries crossed the line from diplomatic exploration into outright intelligence gathering. The third course arrived amid increasing tension. Elaborate pastries filled with cream and seasonal fruits created a visual feast that contrasted sharply with the verbal sparring taking place above them. Catherine noticed that several French delegation members were watching her intently, as if her reaction to their ambassador's provocations was as important as the conversations themselves. Princess Catherine, Du Bois said suddenly, turning his attention directly toward her for the first time. You've been remarkably quiet this evening. I hope you're not finding our discussion too complex for someone of your years. Catherine's heart pounded, but she recognized the trap immediately. He was trying to provoke her into speaking before being formally addressed according to protocol. The comment about complexity was designed to insult her intelligence and maturity, pushing her to defend herself impulsively. She met his gaze steadily, but remained silent, lifting her fork to take another bite of pastry as if his comment had been casual observation rather than calculated provocation. My daughter understands the value of careful listening, King William said, pride evident in his voice despite the circumstances. Admirable, Du Bois said, though his expression suggested disappointment at her restraint. Though one wonders if such reserved nature will serve effectively when difficult decisions must be made quickly. Leadership sometimes requires immediate, decisive action rather than prolonged contemplation. The insult was more direct this time, questioning Catherine's decision-making abilities and suggesting she lacked the strength necessary for effective rule. She felt her jaw clench involuntarily, but forced herself to maintain neutral expression while continuing to eat methodically. In my experience, said a new voice from across the table, the wisest leaders are those who think before they speak. Lady Elizabeth, Catherine's aunt and the king's sister, had entered the conversation for the first time. Impulsive words have caused more wars than careful silence ever has. Du Bois's eyes sharpened with interest. Lady Elizabeth, how good to hear from you. Though I must say, your perspective surprises me. Wasn't it your own aunt who demonstrated the dangers of excessive restraint in diplomatic situations? Catherine felt as if ice water had been poured down her spine. The ambassador was referencing the family tragedy that had given birth to the very rule she was struggling to follow. But he was twisting the story, suggesting that her gray-tant's problem had been too much control rather than too little. "I'm afraid I don't follow your meaning, Ambassador," Lady Elizabeth replied coolly. "Oh, surely you recall the unfortunate incident 50 years ago," Du Bois continued, his voice carrying false sympathy. "When Princess Margaret remained silent during crucial negotiations, failing to clarify her position when misunderstandings arose. Her excessive diplomatic restraint led to the very conflict that cost so many lives." Catherine's fork trembled in her hand. The ambassador was rewriting history, portraying her gray-tant's outburst as silence, and her silence as the cause of war. It was a masterful manipulation, designed to make Catherine question everything she had been taught about that tragic night. But Lady Margaret had prepared her for such tactics. During their training sessions, the governess had warned that skilled diplomats would sometimes present false versions of historical events to provoke emotional reactions. The key was remembering that responding to lies would only give them power. Historical interpretations often vary depending on perspective, Lady Elizabeth said diplomatically, but Catherine could see tension in her aunt's posture. "Indeed they do," Du Bois agreed. "Though I must say, having reviewed the French diplomatic archives, our records suggest a rather different sequence of events than your kingdom's official history might indicate." The threat was clear. The ambassador was claiming to possess evidence that contradicted their family's understanding of the tragedy that had shaped their diplomatic protocols for half a century. Catherine felt the room spinning slightly, overwhelmed by the implications of what he was suggesting. If the French version of events was different, if they blamed her gray-tan silence rather than her outburst, then everything Catherine had been taught about proper diplomatic behavior might be wrong. She might be repeating a 50-year-old mistake rather than avoiding one. But even as these doubts swirled through her mind, Catherine held onto one certain truth. Whatever had actually happened 50 years ago, breaking protocol tonight would demonstrate weakness and uncertainty. She had to trust her training and her father's wisdom, even when faced with information that challenged everything she believed. The fourth course was being served, delicate fish preparations that required the servers to work around the increasingly tense conversation. Catherine noticed that her father's breathing had become more labored, and his complexion had taken on a grayish pallor that concerned her deeply. "Your Majesty," Du Bois said, his voice carrying what might have been genuine concern, "you seem tired. Perhaps we should postpone the remainder of our discussions to allow you proper rest." The offer sounded considerate, but Catherine understood its true meaning. If her father had to leave due to illness, she would be left alone to face the ambassador's verbal attacks without support. Everything they had worked for tonight would be lost, and the peace treaty would crumble along with any confidence in her ability to lead. "I'm quite well, thank you," King William replied firmly, though the effort of speaking seemed to cost him, "and eager to conclude our negotiations this evening." "Of course," Du Bois said, his smile predatory now that he sensed weakness. "Though I hope you'll understand if I address some questions directly to Princess Catherine. After all, these agreements will ultimately be her responsibility to honor." Catherine felt the walls closing in around her. The moment she had been dreading was finally arriving. The ambassador was about to formally address her, which meant she would be allowed to speak. But everything he said before that moment was designed to provoke her into breaking protocol prematurely. The game was entering its final phase, and Catherine realized that her silence until now had been merely preparation for the real test that lay ahead. The fish course continued in an atmosphere of mounting tension, each delicate bite feeling like sand in Catherine's mouth as she waited for Ambassador Du Bois to spring his final trap. She could see him savoring the moment, building anticipation like a cat playing with its prey before delivering the fatal blow. Her father's labored breathing had become more noticeable, and she fought the urge to reach out and touch his hand in support. "Before I formally address Princess Catherine," Du Bois said, Setting down his fork with theatrical precision, I feel compelled to share some rather disturbing intelligence that has recently come to our attention. King William's eyes sharpened despite his obvious fatigue. What manner of intelligence, Ambassador? Reports from our trading partners suggest that certain factions within your kingdom have been, shall we say, less than enthusiastic about the proposed peace treaty, Du Bois replied, his voice carrying false concern. Apparently, some of your military commanders believe that war with France would be more profitable than peace. Catherine felt her stomach drop. If such reports were true, they represented a serious threat to her father's authority and the stability of their government. But she also recognized this could be another manipulation, a fabricated crisis designed to test their reactions and gather information about internal palace dynamics. I'm certain any such reports are either exaggerated or completely false, Lady Elizabeth interjected firmly. Our military serves the crown faithfully. Oh, I'm sure they do, Du Bois agreed with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Though loyalty can be complicated when economic interests are involved. We understand that certain noble families have invested heavily in armament production and would suffer significant losses if peace were to break out. The accusation hung in the air like poison gas. The ambassador was suggesting that their own nobility was actively working against peace for financial gain, implying that Catherine would inherit a kingdom riddled with treachery and conflicting loyalties. Catherine gripped her fork tightly, using the physical sensation to anchor herself against the rising tide of anger and confusion. Everything Du Bois said contained just enough truth to be plausible while being devastating enough to undermine confidence in her family's rule. Economic transitions always present challenges, King William said carefully, but I have complete confidence in the loyalty of our people. Your confidence is admirable, Du Bois replied, though perhaps somewhat naive. For instance, we've received reports that Lord Blackwood has been meeting secretly with weapons manufacturers, discussing the financial benefits of a prolonged military campaign. Catherine's blood ran cold. Lord Blackwood was one of her father's oldest friends and most trusted advisors. If he was actually working against the peace treaty, it would represent a betrayal that would devastate her father and leave Catherine wondering whom she could trust when she assumed the throne. But something in Du Bois's delivery seemed too polished, too perfectly timed. She began to suspect that the ambassador was testing their reactions to see which accusations would provoke the strongest responses, gathering intelligence about their relationships and vulnerabilities. Lord Blackwood's loyalty has never been questioned, Lady Elizabeth said with icy formality. Of course not, Du Bois agreed pleasantly, though I'm curious about Princess Catherine's thoughts on the matter. After all, she'll need to decide whether to retain her father's advisors or make changes when she assumes power. The comment was designed to drive a wedge between Catherine and her father's supporters, suggesting that she might not trust the people who had served her family faithfully for years. It was also an attempt to get her to speak before being formally addressed, using her concern for loyal friends as bait. Catherine remained silent, though her mind raced with questions and fears. Was Lord Blackwood truly loyal? Were there factions within their kingdom working against peace? How would she identify and deal with such threats when she became queen? The ambassador seemed disappointed by her continued restraint, but his eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of someone who had planted seeds of doubt that would continue growing long after he left. There's also the matter of the Northern Territories, Du Bois continued, turning back to King William. Our intelligence suggests that the governors there have been remarkably resistant to peace overtures, claiming that French merchants would destroy local economies. This accusation cut closer to the truth, and Catherine knew it. The Northern Territories had indeed been skeptical of peace agreements, fearing that French competition would undermine their traditional industries. But their concerns were based on legitimate economic worries, not treacherous plotting. Regional concerns are natural during times of transition, King William replied, though his voice had grown weaker. Natural, yes, but also potentially dangerous, Du Bois pressed. What assurances can you provide that Princess Catherine will be able to maintain control over these territories when she inherits? After all, rebellious provinces have a way of inviting foreign intervention. The threat was thinly veiled but unmistakable. If Catherine couldn't maintain unity within her own kingdom, the French might feel justified in interfering to restore stability. The ambassador was essentially demanding proof that she would be strong enough to prevent civil discord that might threaten French interests. Catherine felt the weight of every decision she would someday have to make pressing down on her shoulders. How did anyone prepare for the overwhelming responsibility of ruling a kingdom, especially one facing internal divisions and external threats? A commotion near the kitchen doors interrupted her thoughts. One of the servants had stumbled, sending a tray of crystal glasses crashing to the floor. The sound shattered the tense atmosphere momentarily, but Catherine noticed how quickly the ambassador's attention returned to studying her reaction to the disruption. Even a simple accident was being evaluated for what it might reveal about her composure under pressure. She realized with growing awareness that every moment of this evening was a test, every gesture and expression cataloged for future analysis. Accidents happen, Du Bois observed mildly, though one hopes they don't become patterns. Leadership requires the ability to maintain order even when unexpected events occur. The comment seemed innocent enough, but Catherine understood that he was questioning her ability to handle crises effectively. Would she panic when faced with unexpected challenges? Would she be able to maintain stability when circumstances spiraled out of control? As servants efficiently cleaned up the broken glass, Catherine found herself thinking about all the unexpected events that had shaped her family's history. Wars, plagues, natural disasters, diplomatic crises, each one a test of royal leadership that had either strengthened or weakened their kingdom's position. The dessert course arrived with elaborate ceremony, towering constructions of spun sugar, and delicate pastries that seemed almost too beautiful to eat. Catherine appreciated the brief respite from conversation as everyone focused on the visual spectacle before them. But she knew the respite wouldn't last long. The ambassador had been building towards something all evening, and she sensed that the climax was approaching. Everything that had come before had been preparation for whatever verbal assault he was planning for the meal's conclusion. Such artistry, Du Bois commented, admiring the dessert construction. It reminds me of diplomatic agreements, actually. Beautiful to behold, but so very fragile. One careless movement, and the entire structure collapses. The metaphor was obvious and ominous. He was suggesting that the peace treaty they were negotiating was similarly delicate and could be destroyed by a single mistake or moment of poor judgment. Skilled hands can create lasting beauty, Lady Elizabeth observed, just as skilled diplomacy can create lasting peace. True, Du Bois agreed, though both require steady nerves and careful planning. Impulsive actions tend to destroy rather than create. Catherine understood that he was circling back to questions about her temperament and decision-making abilities. Throughout the evening, he had repeatedly suggested that she might be too young, too emotional, or too inexperienced to handle the responsibilities of leadership. As they began eating their desserts, Catherine noticed that her father was barely touching his food. His hands trembled more visibly now, and his breathing had become shallow and rapid. She wanted desperately to call for the royal physician, but knew that showing weakness in front of the French delegation could be catastrophic for their negotiations. "Your Majesty," Du Bois said with apparent concern, "you really do look quite unwell. Perhaps we should conclude our business this evening and continue tomorrow when you're feeling stronger." "I'm perfectly fine," King William replied firmly, though the effort of speaking seemed enormous. "And eager to finalize the details of our agreement tonight." Du Bois nodded sympathetically, but Catherine could see calculation behind his concerned expression. He was evaluating how much longer he could push before the king's condition became impossible to ignore. "Of course, though I hope you'll forgive me for addressing one final concern directly to Princess Catherine," the ambassador said, his voice taking on formal tones that indicated the moment had finally arrived. After all, she'll be responsible for implementing whatever agreements we reach tonight. Catherine felt her heart hammering against her ribs. This was it. The moment she had been preparing for all evening was finally here. The ambassador was about to formally address her, which meant she would finally be permitted to speak. But whatever he said would be designed to provoke the strongest possible emotional reaction, testing whether she could maintain diplomatic composure under the most extreme pressure. She straightened in her chair, calling upon every lesson Lady Margaret had taught her about grace under fire. Her father's eyes met hers across the table, and in them she saw both encouragement and desperate hope. The future of their kingdom, the lives of thousands of their people, and her own destiny as queen all hung in the balance of whatever came next. Ambassador Du Bois smiled, the expression of a predator finally ready to strike. Princess Catherine, he began formally, his voice carrying across the silent dining room like a judge pronouncing sentence. Princess Catherine, Ambassador Du Bois continued, his formal address echoing through the dining room with the weight of diplomatic protocol. I find myself compelled to ask you directly about certain disturbing reports that have reached the French court regarding your character and fitness for future rule. Catherine felt as though the floor had dropped away beneath her chair, but she forced herself to maintain perfect posture and neutral expression. This was the moment everything had been building toward, and she could feel the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders. These reports, Du Bois continued with devastating precision, suggest that you possess the same volatile temperament that led your great-aunt to destroy peace negotiations 50 years ago. They describe a young woman prone to emotional outbursts, someone who prioritizes personal pride over the welfare of her people. The accusations hit like physical blows, each word carefully chosen to cut as deeply as possible. Catherine could feel heat rising in her cheeks, her hands trembling slightly as she fought to control her reaction. Everything in her wanted to leap to her feet and defend herself, to expose the lies and manipulation behind the ambassador's calculated assault. But she remembered her father's words about true strength, sometimes requiring the swallowing of pride. She remembered the thousands of lives that hung in the balance, the families who would suffer if tonight's negotiations failed. Most importantly, she remembered that this was exactly what Du Bois wanted, to provoke her into an emotional response that would justify breaking the peace treaty. I wonder, the ambassador continued, his voice dripping with false concern, if someone so young and apparently unstable can truly be trusted with the responsibility of maintaining peace between our nations. Perhaps it would be wiser to establish a regency council, or consider alternative succession arrangements that would provide more stability. The suggestion was treasonous in its implications, essentially arguing that she should be removed from the line of succession for the sake of international relations. Catherine felt rage building in her chest like a furnace, threatening to overwhelm her carefully maintained control. She looked across the table at her father, whose face had gone gray with pain and exhaustion. King William's eyes met hers, and in them she saw not just encouragement, but desperate pleading. He needed her to succeed where her great-aunt had failed, to prove that their family had learned from its tragic past. Taking a deep breath, Catherine spoke for the first time that evening, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her heart. Ambassador Du Bois, I appreciate your concerns about my fitness to rule. However, I believe that true leadership is demonstrated through actions rather than words, through the ability to prioritize the welfare of one's people above personal feelings. Du Bois's eyes sharpened with interest. How admirably diplomatic, Your Highness. Though I wonder if such carefully rehearsed responses truly reflect your character, or merely your tutor's coaching. Catherine felt the barb, but continued calmly. I would argue that learning from wise counselors is itself a mark of good leadership. A ruler who cannot accept guidance or control their emotions is indeed dangerous to their people. Yet surely there are limits to such restraint, the ambassador pressed. What happens when someone insults your family's honor, questions your father's wisdom, or suggests that your kingdom is weak and poorly governed? Do you simply sit quietly while your nation's reputation is destroyed? The questions came like hammer blows, each one designed to find the breaking point of her composure. Catherine understood that Du Bois was essentially asking her to choose between defending her family's honor and maintaining diplomatic protocol. I would respond that my kingdom's strength lies not in my personal reactions to insults, but in our institutions, our people's loyalty, and our commitment to peace when possible, strength when necessary, Catherine replied. Personal honor means nothing if pursuing it leads to unnecessary war and suffering. Around the table, she could see surprise and growing respect in the faces of both the French delegation and her own family members. Even Du Bois seemed taken aback by her measured response to his provocations. But he wasn't finished. "How very mature of you, Princess Catherine. Though I confess curiosity about how such philosophy would apply in practical situations. For instance, what if I were to tell you that my government has evidence of your father's financial irregularities in managing the royal treasury?" The accusation was devastating in its implications, suggesting corruption at the highest levels of their government. Catherine felt her carefully maintained composure wavering as anger and hurt warred within her chest. "Or perhaps," Du Bois continued relentlessly, "you'd be interested to know that some members of this very French delegation have expressed doubts about your intellectual capacity to understand complex treaty negotiations. They've suggested that a more experienced regent might be necessary to protect French interests." Catherine's hands clenched into fists beneath the table, but her voice remained steady when she spoke. "Ambassador, I understand that you have concerns about our kingdom's stability and my readiness to lead. Rather than responding to specific accusations, I would prefer to address the underlying issue." "Which is?" Du Bois asked, leaning forward with predatory interest. "Whether I could be trusted to honor agreements and maintain peace," Catherine replied. "I believe that my behavior this evening demonstrates my commitment to diplomacy even under pressure. I have listened respectfully to your concerns, responded thoughtfully to your questions, and maintained appropriate protocol throughout our discussion." The ambassador studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Yet some might argue that such restraint, while admirable in formal settings, could indicate weakness when decisive action is required. Catherine felt a moment of inspiration, drawing upon lessons learned not just from Lady Margaret, but from years of observing her father's approach to leadership. "I would suggest that the ability to remain calm under pressure is precisely what enables good decision-making when quick action is needed. A ruler who cannot control their emotions in conversation is unlikely to make wise choices during crises." For the first time all evening, Ambassador Du Bois seemed genuinely impressed rather than merely calculating. He sat back in his chair, exchanging glances with other members of his delegation before speaking again. "Princess Catherine, I must admit that your responses this evening have been unexpected. When we arrived, I confess that our intelligence reports had led us to anticipate a very different kind of person." Catherine felt a flicker of hope, but remained cautious. "Intelligence reports can be misleading, Ambassador. I hope that direct observation has provided a more accurate picture." "Indeed it has," Du Bois replied, and his tone had shifted subtly from aggressive to respectful. "Your composure, thoughtfulness, and commitment to diplomatic protocol suggest a maturity that goes well beyond your years." King William, who had been growing increasingly pale throughout the evening, managed a weak smile. "My daughter has always understood that leadership requires sacrifice, including the sacrifice of personal pride when necessary. A lesson that some rulers never learn," Du Bois observed, glancing meaningfully around the table. "The French government will be very interested to hear about tonight's educational experience." Catherine realized that the test was essentially over, and somehow, impossibly, she seemed to have passed. The ambassador's aggressive questioning had been designed to evaluate her character under extreme pressure, and her responses had apparently satisfied his concerns about her fitness to rule. But as relief began to wash over her, she noticed that her father was struggling more visibly with each passing minute. His breathing had become labored, and perspiration beaded on his forehead despite the room's comfortable temperature. "Father," she said quietly, "perhaps we should—" "I'm fine," King William insisted, though his voice was barely above a whisper. "We need to conclude tonight's business." Ambassador Du Bois looked between father and daughter with what appeared to be genuine concern. "Your Majesty, I believe we've covered all the essential points for tonight. Perhaps we could finalize the remaining details tomorrow, after you've had proper rest." This time, the offer seemed sincere rather than manipulative. Catherine understood that her performance had changed the ambassador's entire approach to their negotiations. "That would be acceptable," King William agreed reluctantly, clearly recognizing that he couldn't continue much longer. As the formal dinner concluded and guests began to leave, Ambassador Du Bois approached Catherine privately. "Your Highness, I owe you an apology for the intensity of tonight's questioning. My government needed to be certain that we could work constructively with your future leadership." Catherine nodded graciously. "I understand the importance of such evaluations, Ambassador. I hope I've demonstrated that our kingdom values diplomatic solutions and peaceful cooperation." "You have indeed," Du Bois replied. "In fact, you've shown wisdom that many experienced rulers lack. The ability to control one's emotions while remaining intellectually engaged is a rare gift." Later that night, as Catherine helped her father to his chambers with the assistance of the royal physician, she reflected on the evening's events. She had faced the ultimate test of the protocol that had governed royal behavior for 50 years, and she had emerged victorious not through aggression or clever rhetoric, but through the strength that came from putting her people's welfare above her personal pride. "I'm proud of you," King William whispered as she tucked blankets around his frail form. "You've proven yourself worthy of the crown tonight." "I had good teachers," Catherine replied, thinking of Lady Margaret's patient instruction and her father's example of quiet strength. "More than that," the king said, his voice growing stronger despite his physical weakness. "You have the wisdom to understand that true power comes from self-control, not from giving free rein to our emotions." As Catherine returned to her own chambers, she felt profoundly changed by the evening's experiences. She had learned that leadership sometimes required enduring personal attacks with grace, that diplomacy often meant swallowing justified anger for the greater good, and that the single rule she had been taught to never break, remaining silent until formally addressed, was actually about something much larger than protocol. It was about understanding that a ruler's primary responsibility was to their people's welfare, not to their own ego. It was about recognizing that sometimes the strongest response to provocation was measured thoughtfulness rather than immediate retaliation. And it was about having the maturity to separate personal feelings from political necessities. The peace treaty would be signed within days, ensuring that her people could continue rebuilding their lives without the threat of war. The French delegation would report back that the future Queen Catherine possessed the temperament and wisdom necessary for effective leadership. And, most importantly, she had honored the memory of her great-aunt by learning from past tragedy rather than repeating it. As she fell asleep that night, Catherine understood that she had passed more than just a diplomatic test. She had discovered the kind of queen she wanted to become, and the principles that would guide her when she inherited the tremendous responsibility of ruling a kingdom. The single rule she had never broken had taught her the most important lesson of all. True strength came not from the freedom to say whatever one felt, but from the wisdom to know when silence served a greater purpose than speech.